Hello and welcome to Give and Toke, the show that elevates the conversation about cannabis to a higher level. I'm your host Paul O'Donoghue, and today we welcome Rhys Cohen of the Penington Institute. Rhys is a self-confessed drug nerd who has held countless cannabis-related roles over the past decade as he has become a trusted voice within the industry. With a master's in Research and Sociology, Rhys has been a cannabis consultant, editor, advisory board member, and today is the policy officer at the Penington Institute. Penington Institute is an independent drug policy non-profit that is currently developing a comprehensive model for cannabis regulation which prioritises community health and safety. They champion an open, rational and compassionate approach to building and sharing knowledge to reduce drug-related harm and are pushing for an effective regulatory framework for cannabis defined by public health goals prioritising targeted prevention, education and treatment. Penington Institute recently launched their regulated campaign in Victoria to open a public discourse about how cannabis can be safely and effectively regulated here in Australia. Visit pennington.org.au or check out the show notes to take the quiz and join the conversation. If you like what you hear on today's show, please make sure you give us a 5-star rating and review on Apple or Spotify. Click follow or subscribe so that you get our latest episodes as soon as they come out. And please get in touch on Instagram at giveandtoke, email us at giveandtoke@gmail.com or visit giveandtoke.com.au to check out our awesome range of merch. But for now, please enjoy my conversation with Rhys Cohen. Welcome to the show, Rhys Cohen. It's great to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
It was really good to see you in person at UIC. I enjoyed listening to you speak, and I hope you had a great weekend overall. What did you get out of your weekend in Brisbane at United in Compassion?
It was fun. I mean, I got to hang out with some old friends and some good friends, even some non-cannabis people who just happened to be in Queensland. So that was a real treat. The conference was awesome, as it always is, sort of bigger and better. It was really encouraging to hear the TGA and the other sort of regulators reaffirm a commitment to evidence-based policymaking. There was quite an interesting discussion about, some of the concerns that have been raised by the Queensland branch of the College of Psychiatrists and others about, potential harms from medicinal cannabis use. And it was encouraging to hear Robin Langham from the TGA basically say, yeah, well, we need to see some evidence before we take any sort of firm action on that or recommend firm action on that. So that was kind of cool. The other thing, I wasn't actually there for it. This was on the Friday, but I heard that Lucy and the organizers had managed to somehow coordinate the ability for people to actually see and smell different cannabis products. And do like a show and tell kind of exercise. And I'm annoyed that I missed that, but that's the first time that I've heard of something like that being able to happen, within Australia. So I thought that was quite innovative of them. So hopefully more of that to come.
Yeah, it's a really fantastic weekend. It was my first one, and I've described it to outsiders as kind of cannabis school camp, like you go and you catch up with all these people, and there's all the different groups, and there's people you've met on the internet that you haven't met in real life, and it's a hell of a lot of fun. Like it's something that I think, started as kind of having a bit more of an industry focus, but I can see definitely the benefit for patients like me attending and, hearing some of the, I don't know, you'll appreciate this, some of the nerdy content, some of the stuff about low doses of cannabinoids helping mice and improving cognitive function and things like that. Like I get really excited about that stuff, in addition to obviously all the regulatory stuff, really great talks from really good speakers, including yourself. So a wonderful weekend all around and a hell of a lot of fun. I look forward to the next one.
Oh, thank you. Very kind. Yeah, you're spot on, I think, with the school camp analogy, right? Because UIC's been going on since 2014, I think Lucy put on the first UIC. And for the first several years of medical cannabis being legal in Australia, there was only one event that happened every year. There was no cannabis, there was no trade publication of any kind. So, people just had like one-on-one relationships with each other, and then UIC was the only real opportunity that you got per year to sort of sit around and catch up and see what other people are up to. So it does feel quite nostalgic, for me. And I'm glad to hear that you had a good time as well.
Great fun, great fun. Well, I want to talk about you, Rhys. We're going to talk about a few things today, including the Penington Institute, the regulated campaign, some of your thoughts on some hot topics. But I do want to kick off talking about you. You hold a Bachelor of International and Global Studies, receiving first-class honours on a thesis that explored regulated markets in the US, along with a Master's in Sociology, which focused on medicinal cannabis policy reforms in Australia. You've consulted, you've been a member of advisory boards, and so much more. Why did you choose cannabis, or perhaps even why did it choose you?
It fascinated me. I mean, I've always, I've been someone who's used cannabis, throughout my young adulthood, and to this day. And at the time when I was at university, so this was sort of circa 2013, 14, 15, I was really interested in seeing what was going on in the states at the moment. So around that time was the legalization of recreational cannabis in Colorado and Washington State, and the sort of lead up and fallout of that. And at the time, I was studying political economy. Like I was looking at, economics, looking at economics as if it were a social science. And this, watershed moment in global drug law reform sort of happened, while I was researching exactly these kinds of phenomena. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I'm planning to do an honors year and I need to write a thesis. I've got to pick a topic that's going to keep me engaged for a whole year. I've got to pick one topic that I'm going to be writing about all year and I can't get bored of it. So I better pick something that I'm really interested in. And so I sort of I picked that, the sort of legalization of cannabis in the US as my topic area. And sort of the rest is history, just kept going basically. Like the more you learn about something and the more time you spend around it, the more interested you become in it. And it's sort of this virtuous cycle. But I think what really sort of hooked me in from the early days was the patient stories and the experiences of patients that I met very, very early on, even before cannabis was legal for medical purposes, and when it was, highly restricted. And had the opportunity to largely thanks to Paul and Charlene Mabor to sort of travel around Australia and deliver these talks to communities and hear from people, and you would just constantly have people walk up to you after the talk and be like, hey, I have this condition, or I'm here with my child, and we're desperate, or we're really motivated to do something here, but it's really hard. And eventually you hear enough of those stories and you just get a bit radicalized by them, I suppose. That's sort of what got me into it.
You've been a trusted voice in this space. When I mention your name, you're someone who is revered and someone who is respected, someone who is thoughtful, and coming up on kind of 10 years of operating in this space. Tom Varga from Green Farmers says that a cannabis year is like a dog year. So you've been working in cannabis for 70 years. Looking back, kind of what are some of your fondest memories, or what are kind of some of the standouts, whether it's places you visited, people you met, kind of what springs to mind as some of kind of the defining moments?
Oh, wow, that's a really interesting question. I I think one moment that immediately comes to mind is in 2018. So then I was working at the Lambert Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapeutics at the University of Sydney. So working with Ian McGregor and the team there, and that was a fantastic place to work for so many reasons. And in 2018, there was a real sort of turning point in terms of access to medical cannabis. So that was when the federal government coordinated the states and territories to streamline their patient access approval processes and to sort of unify that within the TGA. And so you went from people waiting 6, 8, 12, 24 weeks for an assessment, which may or may not be an approval of a SASB application, to a commitment that those would be assessed within 48 hours. And it really did. I mean, it was not smooth necessarily. There's some pain moments, but I do very clearly remember that moment in time and accessing SASB approval data through FOI requests before they had the data portal. And I remember printing out these graphs, and just every month I would tack a new graph onto my corkboard in front of me at work. Yeah, that felt really like a really important moment in time.
It's really interesting, and maybe this is a rabbit hole and too broad a topic, but to think about back then, 7 years ago, where it was weeks, months to get an approval down to 48 hours, to now we're seeing, criticisms of the industry based on the fact that someone can be approved that day, maybe for not great reasons. What do you think about how far we've come? I think a lot of people talk about how slow this industry is, but if you take that on, 7 years from months to get approved to the same day approval, how do you feel about how far we've come in that time?
It's been really disorienting, the speed at which things have happened. You don't even have to look back that far or that many years to see the sorts of exponential growth that we're now experiencing. Like I think it was really COVID 2020, 2021 was when a gear shifted in terms of patient access and acceptance in the community, and people started finessing these business models that were better, that got better and better at satisfying people's desire to access cannabis for whatever reason. And it sort of took off from there, I think. And I mean, every year the medical cannabis space looks different to how it was previously, but we have, collectively, the community has seen a pretty rapid and stark transformation from a much more traditionally medical market. Like I remember in 2020 talking about how, Australia will, dry flower will never really be a big category in Australia because we're a really tightly regulated medical market, and it's all about the oils really, and maybe there'll be a little bit here and there, and then within 12 months or so, that ratio had completely changed, and now and it just became a huge dry flower market, and that's where we've ended up to this day.
It's a broad topic, but given your experience analysing overseas markets in an academic sense and working and advising in so many capacities in Australia, how would you describe the state of the Australian market 9 years into legalisation? Obviously we've already touched on how fast it's moved, some of these clinics that have come along and really changed the landscape. How would you analyse the last 9 years?
It's been a really profound validation of community expectations, I think, would be one way to think about it. Yes, more and more people are getting access to medical cannabis now, and the numbers look like a hockey stick. But this isn't a new demand from the community. This is an existing, latent, ongoing demand that Australians have had for many, many, many years. So at the end of the day, that's what I think good drug policies should do, is manage the realities of the communities in which we live, and do our best to help protect community health and safety. And in my mind, clearly providing regulated products is through a lawful access route is vastly preferable to accessing unregulated illegal products from criminal networks. Whether someone's reasons for using cannabis are medical or non-medical doesn't matter.
My next question is, what do we still need to get right? This might lean a little bit too much into our upcoming conversation about Penington, but if we were just thinking medicinally, what is it that we still need to get right?
If cannabis is a medicine, and if it's being used for medical purposes, it should be treated like a medicine. That's a belief that I've always held quite strongly. And I've always been a bit uncomfortable with how the medical framework has been expanded to accommodate demand for non-medical cannabis. I fully support the regulation of cannabis for adults to use, but I've always been a little bit anxious about how the medical framework has been sort of distorted slightly in order to better accommodate community demands. I don't think it's the appropriate place for it. Like, in my mind, the best thing that we could do for the medical cannabis framework in Australia is regulate cannabis for adult use at retail market for adults, because the biggest issue that I have with medical cannabis in Australia at the moment is, if I've got a sick family member who I want to point in the right direction to get access to medical cannabis, they jump online, they're very unlikely to find the sort of clinic that's going to provide them with good quality medical care. They're very likely to find a clinic that's set up in order to provide quick, easy, and cheap access to cannabis.
Great point.
Which is fine, but it's not, that's not what medicine is really meant to be about. And I've had this happen to family and friends in the past who have ended up receiving really poor quality medical care from a clinic that's set up to provide to a different class of patient or consumer. There's nothing inherently, good or bad about that. It's just that it's not the appropriate place for it.
Yeah.
So I think coming back to, refocusing or allowing, freeing up, liberating the medical cannabis framework to return to its medical focus, I think would be a huge benefit.
That's a really great point. I think there's an analogy like, you're going to a lovely dinner and you need a nice bottle of wine, so that you're seeking a sommelier in a boutique liquor store, and then your only option is a Thirsty Camel drive-through. Like, it's people need genuine healthcare, but every time a friend messages me a screenshot of their order, I just kind of sigh, because I'm like, come on, man, you know me. You could have asked me about a dozen clinics that would have actually helped you. These are people with endometriosis and people with, diverticulitis and different IBS issues and things like that. And I'm like, I'm happy that you've stopped going to your dealer, but I think there's about 15 other clinics that I would have preferred you to go to. So it's an interesting point, and I wonder, do you think the operators within the medicinal market could steward us towards a regulated market, some form of retail outlets and things like that? Because one thing I worry about is, in Canada, for example, medicinal cannabis kind of fell by the wayside when we did have a regulated market. Federal legalization came in, wiped out a lot of the culture on one side, and also, unfortunately, a lot of the medicinal aspects. So I guess a better question is, how do we preserve an authentic medicinal market as we move towards regulation?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And the Canadian experience, there's a lot we can take from it. And there are some cautionary tales there for sure. I don't think our medical framework will be impacted in the same way that Canada's was, for a few reasons. Canada never really had a capital M medical framework, right? Like, unlike Australia, Canadian doctors don't write prescriptions. You don't get your medical cannabis from a pharmacy. It's taxed like a consumer good, not like a medicine. There are so many weaknesses and choke points built into the Canadian medical cannabis framework that made it more vulnerable, I think, than Australia's. If you look at Australia, very robust, medical cannabis framework that's been integrated into mainstream healthcare. You have pharmacies, you have prescriptions, you have private health insurance, coverage, reimbursement opportunities. Often there's no GST on medical cannabis products. So I think we have a lot more going for us in terms of the potential resilience of our medical cannabis framework in Australia.
So I think it's really good that you make that point clear, is that there isn't really a robust kind of rigorous system there anyway. So it was kind of easy to fall by the wayside because it didn't have the checks and balances ours do. So I think that's a good point. I think, like all these things, there's nuance. It's easy for me to say, oh, medical cannabis fell by the wayside in Canada, but they weren't ever doing it fantastically anyway. Like, a lot of people celebrate what we do, a lot of people criticize what we do, but you can't fault the desire for rigor in what we do. One of the things that actually came up from your talk is that 70% of Australian cannabis users are still accessing illicit products. Why do you think this is, and how do we reduce that number?
Yeah, so this was data from the 2022-23 household survey. That's about a year old now, I think, that data, but it's still worth pointing out. So that's nationally representative survey data of Australians. And so, of all of the Australians who say that they have used cannabis for medical purposes at least once in the last 12 months, about 30% of them said that they access medical cannabis through a prescription, sometimes or all the time. So that leaves 70% of people not yet accessing regulated medical cannabis products. That strikes me as like surprisingly low. And like, maybe it's a time series thing. Like, that data was collected probably close to 2 years ago now. So I think the data today would probably be quite different. But it does really speak to just how much unmet demand there is for regulated medical cannabis products among people who use cannabis for medical purposes, which is really, I think, encouraging for the sector, because look at how big we are now, how quickly we're growing. I think clearly there's still room left to grow, and that's just by helping people who use cannabis for medical purposes currently. That's not even talking about people who don't use cannabis for medical purposes but could benefit from it, or people who use cannabis for non-medical purposes. I think there's probably a lot more. Every time we look at these survey results, I'm always scratching my head going, really, is that it? Like, are those numbers too conservative? I feel like maybe there's a lot more use of cannabis in the Australian community than these kinds of surveys are really capable of identifying, but that's just speculation.
But it's warranted speculation, because I think those of us that operate in this space know how forthcoming we can be and how freely we can talk about it. But then so many people do go back to other worlds. For me, it's as a primary school teacher, it's not a part of the conversation in my day-to-day work. If people go back to their lives with their family and friends, my mum uses medicinal cannabis and still wishes I didn't. So it's really interesting to see how truthful people are willing to be. There's many reasons why people might not admit to, genuine use, why people might not pursue genuine use. But I think that's warranted speculation. And I think that's a good segue into the Penington Institute itself. So established in 2014, but with a story that spans back to the 1980s, named after Professor David Penington. Tell me about the organization, who is involved, and how it came to be.
Yeah, so Penington Institute was originally formed as the Association of Needle Exchange Providers, or ANEX. And we're a not-for-profit sort of drug policy organization based in Melbourne. We're a relatively small group, so there's probably about sort of 10 or 12 staff, but we're really well supported by an extraordinary board of directors and a whole bunch of experts who contribute to our advisory boards and things like that. So for people in the medical cannabis space, you may have come across Professor Nicola Saris and Mick Palmer AO, so they're both board members, for example. And we also have board expertise that spans the range of Penington Institute's interests and activity. So, cannabis law reform, understanding what's going on with cannabis policy in Australia is one of our key focus areas at the moment. But of course, we operate across the range of. We're interested in all drugs and maximizing community health and safety with regards to drugs, regardless of what that drug is.
And obviously, one of the strings to your bow is the work that you do with Overdose and the annual Overdose report and Overdose Awareness Day. Tell us kind of what does the community need to better understand about overdose and addiction? One of the big profound learnings for me was from Gabor Mate that addiction is not the opposite of sobriety, it's the opposite of connection. And it really helps kind of humanize the people going through these things. What's the work that you're doing on awareness and on addiction awareness, and what does the community need to better understand about addiction?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I'll answer the easier part of that first, which is the publication and then the work that we do around raising awareness of overdose. I think what people, what Australians could benefit from learning more about is just how many people do, unfortunately, tragically, die of an unintentional drug-related overdose every year. More Australians die of an unintentional drug-related overdose every year than the national road toll, and that's been the case for many years now. So, we're talking thousands of Australians dying every year from unintentional drug-related overdoses. And when you look at the statistics about who this is happening to and how this is happening, surprisingly, there's an awful lot of prescription medications being involved in fatal overdoses, and a lot of polysubstance use, or a lot of multi-drug related deaths. So I think a lot more needs to be. I mean, many people in the community, lay people, would be aware of and concerned about the health harms from, say, heroin or methamphetamine or other drugs of concern, but might feel fine or not be concerned about taking a prescription opioid or taking a prescription benzodiazepine or taking both in combination, and not being attentive to the risks that are involved with all drugs, including prescription drugs. And then, there's also this intersection between drug use and harms from drug use and drug-related deaths and addiction. Now, often, people who lose their lives to a drug-related overdose do struggle with addiction and do have substance use problems, but not all the time. And tragically, I mean, all deaths are tragic. And drug-induced overdose deaths include, people who took a pill at a music festival or took what they thought was just a bit of cocaine, and it turns out it was polluted with dangerous synthetic opioids. So it really, overdose touches everyone in all corners of our communities. And that's what the Overdose Report and the International Overdose Awareness Day campaign are all about, is drawing people's attention to the numbers. If you can't count it, it doesn't matter. So highlighting those statistics and those human stories is really important work.
Talking specifically about cannabis regulation now, you at the Penington Institute recently launched the Regulated campaign in Victoria, and I highly recommend people get over to the website and take the quiz to learn more about the campaign. That link is in the show notes below. What can you tell us about the campaign and its aims? Obviously it's to regulate cannabis in Victoria. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so the Regulator campaign is about starting community conversations about cannabis regulation. We think that cannabis should be regulated for adults to use in Australia. We know that a majority of Victorians, according to research that we commissioned not too long ago, also support that. And across the Australian community, there's widespread support, well over 80% support for the removal of criminal penalties for the possession and use of cannabis. So that's where the community's at. The community knows that the current approach to regulating cannabis isn't working and is producing more harm than good. The next step is to motivate people to care about that issue. It's basically to take actions in response to how they feel about that issue. So I think it's fair to say that most people, like you and I, Paul, we live and breathe cannabis all the time. Most of the time when we talk to people, we're talking to people who know about and care about cannabis or cannabis policy or cannabis law reform. But most people in the community spend almost no time thinking about that in their daily lives. So even if they would support regulated cannabis, in a hypothetical scenario, it doesn't keep them up at night. And it's not something that they bring up over Sunday dinner or whatever. So that's what the Regulated campaign was meant to be about. It was about provoking thought and conversation in the community and get people thinking about, oh, well, what do I think about regulation? What does regulate cannabis mean to me? What kinds of controls or concerns, are around that? What kind of framework would I want to see in my community? So that was kind of the aim of the campaign. And it invited people to take a quiz, short little 5-question quiz about some key policy areas and provide opportunity for people to get in contact with us and start a conversation, basically.
I really laud the format of the quiz. I think that's really good. It's a non-proselytizing, neutral stance where you guys go, hey, answer these questions and see what you think. And I was obviously surprised to see that I actually respectfully disagree with a couple of the points. However, I know that Penington's idea and approach is to create a safe, regulated access. And my desires might not fit into precisely what is a safe, regulated approach, particularly one that people are on board with. So I personally don't believe in capping THC and I don't believe in plain packaging, though I do know you at the Penington Institute are smarter than I am. So therefore, what are the reasons why something like that might be necessary? In a perfect world, I might not want it, but I do need to accept that these are kind of necessary compromises to get things over the line. So specifically talking about THC caps and plain packaging, what's the motivation behind those decisions?
Yeah, great question. Well, it's not about being smarter than or knowing better than or anything like that. It's as you say, like this is about figuring out a solution that works for everyone, including people who don't want cannabis to be regulated. And if we can't bring people on the fence over to the sensible evidence-based side, then we're going to lose. So any cannabis regulatory framework is going to disappoint some people, if not most people, and maybe if it disappoints everyone equally, that's the sign of a good
that's
framework.
Democracy right there.
That's democracy, the sensible center. But to your specific questions about potency and packaging, there is evidence that cannabis can be harmful. Of course, cannabis carries health risks with it, and the evidence I think is pretty clear that using more cannabis and consuming more THC tends to increase the risk of harms, all else being equal. One of the things that we can do to sort of manage that is to limit how potent some of these products can be, much like we do with regulating different strengths of alcoholic drinks, for example. You can't walk into a liquor store and buy 90% ethanol vodka. So there's good reasons to have sort of sensible controls on those sorts of things, I think. And the same with product packaging. Don't get me wrong. I like the idea of flashy, fun packaging. That sounds like fun to me, but I'm not, the most important sort of target audience here. We're talking about people who have concerns about the commercialization of cannabis, people who have concerns about cannabis, quote unquote, being promoted or normalized. And at the end of the day, like fun packaging and stuff is nice, but like, does it really matter that much? Like if you're buying a cannabis product because the packaging looks better than the other one, is that really a health informed choice that you're making about the kinds of cannabis that you use? If I had my way, if I could wave a magic wand, there'd be no commercial advertising of any products ever, because I basically don't think it's necessary. But especially so for products that have the potential to cause harm or that are risky, we should absolutely have, to begin with, a complete ban on advertising for, say alcohol, for example, or gambling or cannabis. I think it's entirely unnecessary to advertise these products. People will seek them out regardless. And same goes for packaging. Packaging is just another form of opportunity for advertising and brand differentiation. Which is not inherently good or bad, but I think when it comes to products that have the potential to be risky and cause harm, yeah, we should choose not to do that if we have the option.
Yeah, I must admit that some of my opposition to plain packaging is rooted in whataboutism. As we look at kind of the way that craft beer can just have, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers on there, and a 6-year-old might be like, I want that 7.5% sour beer. I think in a perfect world, we'd actually reduce alcohol advertising, gambling advertising, and things like that. We'd have a lot more plain packaging on a lot more harmful things. So no, I do agree there, and I do appreciate the the respectful dialogue about points of difference, because I am aware that we do need these things to get it over the line. Lack of advertising, not available to people under 18. What's the fifth tenet of the quiz? If I've lost it off the top of my head. Oh,
I
not
think
being
it's
able to
probably
smoke.
about using in public. Yeah.
Yes, exactly right. So these are all compromises that those of us who are pro cannabis need to make in order to get this over the line, to be respectful of people that might not be as supportive of it.
I want to emphasize that the point of this campaign is not to lecture
Yeah.
the community about what they should or shouldn't be supporting. It is genuinely about starting a conversation. So if people feel really strongly that and disagree with these points or any points, or have other points to bring up, and want to engage with us about those issues, that's exactly what this campaign is for. So I would invite anyone who has a difference of opinion, or even shares my opinion or our opinion about cannabis law reform, to get in touch and tell us, because that's what this exercise is part of. In addition to the regulated campaign and what we're sort of putting out publicly, we have been for a long time, and we continue to do extensive expert and community consultation sessions. Meeting with people, meeting with stakeholders, meeting with medical experts, meeting with legal experts, people who use cannabis, people in this, in the justice sector, and being like, hey, what about cannabis? Like, what are the principles that should guide this? What are your concerns? And it's tricky because we're a servant of 10,000 masters, but that's the only way that you get this kind of work done. I think is just slowly, painfully readjusting and considering and assessing and reassessing your positions on things.
Yeah, I'm not sure how it works from a legislative perspective, but one of the issues I faced when I was in Canada was there weren't mechanisms to adjust things as time travels along, and that's the thing that I want to see. Like I'm fine with a conservative approach to regulation as long as there's inbuilt mechanisms to review and adjust without needing massive legislative change again. And all I hope is that however it might work, and it might be a fantasy, is that we have the ability to reflect on things and change and adjust as we go. I think starting conservative is fine as long as we can make changes and improvements.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree with you more. Like, there's no point engaging in a bold policy reform if you're not going to assess and track how things turn out and be prepared to adjust things on an ongoing basis, because, regulations are never static. Communities are never static. Everything is in constant change and flux. So, unless you have, like you said, there's inbuilt mechanisms from the outset to monitor, assess, iterate, improve, and do it transparently as well. Because we need to make sure that the community is along for the ride. I mean, it would be awful if we introduced a regulated cannabis framework of some kind and it wasn't working for whatever reason, and those problems weren't addressed quickly enough, and the community said, you know what, you had your go, we're not interested in regulated cannabis anymore, it didn't work for us, and that's a possibility. So we need to be attentive to that.
What has been the response to the campaign so far? It is to create dialogue and create a conversation. How has it been received?
Shockingly, fine. I mean, we've had, I can't remember what number we're up to at the moment, but a lot of responses to the quiz. Several thousand people from Victoria alone, I think. We've had a lot of people visiting the website, which has been great. We've had a lot of engagement, particularly on social media, to the campaign. But we put up huge billboards and posters all around Melbourne with what we felt were probably going to be quite provocative messages, and completely expected to get a barrage of extremely negative communication, or to have the ads pulled. This is entirely, I thought that was 50-50. but the zero. No one on Talkback Radio complained about it. Like, no, you know what I mean? Like, none of the advertisers were bothered. We didn't get a lot of angry phone calls from concerned, members of the community, which it made, sort of sitting there scratching our head. And we're like, well, maybe cannabis regulation just isn't that controversial after all. Like, maybe that's where we're at in Victoria anyway at the moment. Is maybe we're comfortable enough with the idea that it's no longer salacious to suggest that we should regulate cannabis on a billboard, which is really encouraging, actually, in a lot of ways. So, the response was different to what we expected, but I think in a good way.
Rhys, I really appreciate all your responses and all your thoughtfulness. We're going to take a little break from the serious stuff right now to have fun with a quiz. Now, in my research, you shared with me that you're a lover of film and television, but you also shared a laundry list of other interests, including cycling, chicken burgers, indoor rock climbing, video games, board games, and beer. So in honor of all of your hobbies, this quiz is called Rhys's Pieces, and I'm going to quiz you about film and television shows relating to your interests. So there are 6 multiple choice questions in the quiz. Any questions before we start?
Oh, gosh. No, I guess not. Let's give it a crack.
Question 1. Which movie follows a young boy who dreams of becoming a professional cyclist and enters a prestigious race in the French Alps? Is it The Groomsman, Breaking Away, or Tour de France?
Well, okay. I don't think it's Groomsman. I don't know the answer to this question. The other two both sound plausible. I would go with. Do you know what wasn't on your list, which I thought you were going to be asking about? Is there's a French animated film called The Triplets of Belleville,
right?
Which viewers might be interested in checking out. It's really great. I do recommend it. But that's about a young cyclist who gets abducted to cycle in an underground cycling ring. Anyway,
that sounds way more badass than the one I'm asking you about.
let's go. Was it Breakaway? The mid one.
That is correct. Well done. I like your process of elimination there. It is a 1979 film starring Dennis Quaid and Daniel Stern. High rating on IMDb, but I must admit not one that I'd heard of before the quiz. Question 2. In which TV show does the main character, a high school teacher, own a restaurant that serves a popular chicken burger? Is it Parks and Recreation, The Mindy Project, or The Office?
Okay. I don't think it's Parks and Rec, although I'm not up to date on Parks and Rec. The Office I've seen bits and pieces of, but I couldn't confidently rule it in or out. But I don't remember any chicken burger shop there, so I'm going to have to go with the middle option again. What was it? Mindy's?
The Mindy Project. You're 2 from 2. This process of elimination, Rhys, I need to recommend this to other guests because you're being very thoughtful about some weird questions.
I got a 33% chance of guessing right, so I think I'm okay. Yeah.
So main character Mindy Lahiri owns a restaurant where chicken burgers are one of the main featured menu items. I will take ChatGPT's word for that one. Question 3. Which movie features a climber attempting to break the world record for free soloing, which is climbing without ropes, the famous El Capitan rock face? Is it?
That's Free Solo, yeah, with Alex Honnold. Yeah, that's a great movie.
Correct. You didn't even need to hear the options there. The other options were Vertical Limit and Cliffhanger, which are movies rather than documentaries. So nailed it. He did the climb in 2017, and the documentary was released in 2018. Mate, you're 3 from 3.
Really awesome doco as well. Like he's a fascinating character. Like his psychology is really different. Yeah.
I'll definitely check that one out. Not one I'd heard of before this quiz, so thank you for the tip. All right, 3 from 3, question 4. In the video game themed TV show The Witcher, based on the book series, what is the protagonist Geralt of Rivia's main weapon? Is it a sword, a crossbow, or a bow and arrow?
It's a sword.
That is correct. Are you a fan of the show?
I really loved season 1. Season 2, I lost track of the plot pretty much completely, and I haven't gone back to the well. But I never played The Witcher, but my housemate at the time played it constantly. But I very fondly remember playing, forcing him to play game after game of Gwent, which is like an in-game card game.
Right.
For hours on end. I just found that very satisfying. Yeah.
Love an in-game game. Fantastic. All right, you are absolutely killing this, man. We've got 2 to go. Question 5. In the 2018 movie Game Night, what game do the characters play that leads to a real-life crime investigation? Is it Scrabble, Monopoly, or Clue?
I don't know the answer to this question, but if it's a crime investigation, then it would probably be Clue or Cluedo, right?
That is
The
correct.
powers of deduction. Oh, mate, you are absolutely killing it. Our lucky last question. Let's see if you can go 6 from 6. In the TV show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, what is the name of the bar the characters run? Is it the Drunken Duck, Paddy's Pub, or the Shamrock Bar?
It's Paddy's Pub.
That
That
is
is
correct.
correct.
6 from 6 on Reese's Pieces, man. Absolutely superb.
Pretty good.
Well done.
Who is there like a wall of fame or something? Like people who've gotten all the questions
I
right?
need to do that. Thank you for planting that seed. Actually, I'm going to go back and I'm going to start ranking people. So you're at 100%. I'm sure it's happened before, but I also want to find the opportunity to shame those people who got 0%. You know, each week there's a quiz. I'm like, oh, don't forget so and so scored 0. So yes, you're high up on the leaderboard there, Rhys. Thanks for playing.
Yeah, cool. Pleasure. Thanks.
All right, we're going to move towards the tail end of the show now. And, you know, you're an essential follow on LinkedIn because of the articles you share, but also the thoughtful editorial. You don't just pop something up, you give your thoughts. And I want to discuss some of the things you've shared recently, hoping you could shed some light on them for the patient audience. You know, I think there's a business lens on LinkedIn, but on this show, there's a patient lens. First thing I want to talk about is the vape battery ban. So cannabis vapes have been caught up in the federal government's crackdown on nicotine vapes, meaning patients are struggling to access devices. What is the sense in this? What the hell is going on?
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. Let's not wade too far into the federal government's vaping policy in general, because I'll be here all day, and I'll probably say something I end up regretting. But it is so unfortunate that medical cannabis has been the collateral damage of these quite rapidly developed and implemented policy reforms. I think it's very unfortunate and entirely preventable, or would have been entirely preventable. From a logical perspective, if the TGA is providing an approval for a product that can only be used with a 510 battery, they must also approve access to the 510 battery. That just stands to reason. I understand why, from a bureaucratic perspective, it isn't as straightforward as that necessarily, but it doesn't really pass the pub test. I think what's also really frustrating, which is related to that, is accessing dry herb vaporizers in Australia. It's become so much harder now because they're also controlled as a vaping device, which serves no purpose as far as I'm concerned, because dry herb vaporization is a less harmful way of inhaling cannabis than smoking it. So, this is a really important harm reduction tool that many people rely on, and that we should actually be really encouraging people to swap to. Australians famously, very often smoke cannabis and mix it with tobacco, and that's the best way to maximize the health harms of cannabis, is to smoke it mixed with tobacco. So the idea that we would just restrict access to it, to a whole class of devices that are designed to reduce that risk, I think is just really short-sighted. Yeah.
Our final segment is called Pauls of Wisdom, and though we value the long-form conversation, we try to leave the listener with a key takeaway, dinner party fact, or even call to action. So, Rhys, what is your Paul of Wisdom?
Fun fact. Okay, so in Australia, we spend about $2 billion a year policing cannabis. And as a result of that, the law enforcement agencies managed to intercept less than 3% of the cannabis that's used across the Australian community. So of all the cannabis that Australians use every year, less than 3% is intercepted by law enforcement agencies for the cost of about $2 billion.
So what you're saying is we should up the budget to $200 billion for the police?
Yeah, we could. That's one way to do it. Change the numerator or the denominator. Yeah. I don't know if the community would support that.
No. And especially, my first-hand experience at 420 in Melbourne last year, where, there's just, I think it was $120,000 worth of cops there that day. It's a little bit unfortunate to see the resources that go into it too. I think they ended up charging 30 people and arresting 2 people for, having cannabis that wasn't in a pharmaceutical container. So definitely resources that could be better spent elsewhere. I do appreciate that, Paul of Wisdom. Now it's our last chance for self-promo. Obviously, the regulated quiz is down the bottom in the show notes. Is there anything else you want to drive people's attention towards?
Yeah, go to the Penington Institute website and check out our other work, because we publish really useful sort of analysis and insights on cannabis policy, but also, as you pointed out earlier in the show, the overdose and Australia's annual overdose report. We've got a whole bunch of webinars that we put on. Some of them are specific to cannabis policy, but others are to do with drug-related harms from other drugs, and they're all available on the Penington Institute website. So yeah, go there, check it out. And if you're interested in reaching out and having a conversation, please get in touch, send us an email and say hi.
Excellent. Well, Rhys Cohen, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today. My favorite cannabis nerd in the world. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Paul. Real pleasure.